You're listening to the Taylor Marshall Show, episode 41, and today I sit down with Brother Bradley Elliott of the Dominican Order, and we talk about Thomas Aquinas' teaching on the 5 intellectual virtues and how they relate to culture, art, and pornography. You're not going to want to miss this one. All coming up next. Howdy, and thank you for tuning in to the Taylor Marshall Show. This is the podcast for everyone who wants to create daily habits and learn enough theology to take their faith to the next level. And my goal this week is to share with you the 5 intellectual virtues according to Saint Thomas Aquinas. I sit down today with Brother Bradley Elliott. He's a fellow of the new Saint Thomas Institute and a friar of the Dominican Order. And he explains for us the 5 intellectual virtues. You know, we know the 3 theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, and the cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. But most of us were never taught the 5 intellectual virtues. So we're going to learn about those today and how they relate to the moral life, specifically how they relate to key topics such as pornography, art, and the building of culture. Now, also at the end of this podcast, I have a very special announcement that I've been waiting to make for several weeks now. So after this podcast is over, continue to listen, and I'll explain that to you, a special offer that you can get as a listener to this podcast. And I hope you really enjoy this one. Brother Bradley of the Dominicans does a great job, so here it is. Enjoy. I'm privileged to be here today with Brother Bradley Thomas Elliott of the Dominican Order. Welcome, brother.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. How are you?
I'm doing great. Good. Well, we've got a good topic today.
Cool, yes.
It's something that a lot of people have never considered and maybe don't even know, that there are, of course, the theological virtues, faith, hope, charity. There are the cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. But today we're going to talk about the intellectual virtues.
Yes.
The intellectual virtues, which are talked about by Aristotle and then carried up by Thomas Aquinas. But before we get into that, I want you to tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Well, Dr. Marshall, my name is Brother Bradley Thomas Elliott. I'm a Dominican student brother, so I'm studying to be a priest. I'm not ordained yet. I still have 4 more years in the process. But I belong to the Western Dominican province of the Order of Preachers. That's the province of the Most Holy Name of Jesus, is the title of our province. I love that title. And right now, I'm in San Francisco, California. Our studium is in Oakland. We study at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in Berkeley, which is actually an amazing environment because we have all sorts of schools around, all sorts. There's a great variety of learning going on there, so it's a great opportunity.
Awesome. Yeah, if I could live anywhere and I didn't have children or anything, San Francisco is just beautiful. I love it.
I love San Francisco. I'm growing to love it more and more every day. It's a beautiful city.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Okay, so let's get down into these intellectual virtues. Yeah. Why don't we just start off and we'll name these intellectual virtues. Go for it.
Well, you're right, first of all, in saying that they're in many ways the forgotten virtues. We hear all about the theological virtues, certainly within Catholic spirituality, faith, hope, and charity. We talk regularly about the cardinal virtues, which are, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. But St. Thomas, following Aristotle, names 5 intellectual virtues. And Aristotle, he talks about these, and I believe it's book 6 in the Nicomachean Ethics. There are 5 intellectual virtues. First is wisdom. Second is knowledge, or science. Third is understanding. Fourth is art. The 5th is prudence. prudence is actually an intellectual virtue too. It's one that's not as forgotten, of course, because it's also numbered amongst the moral virtues for specific reasons. So
now, and one of those in particular, art.
Yes.
There's some confusion, some debate about it. What is it in the Greek, and how does Thomas understand that? Because I think a lot of people who are watching right now are thinking, okay, yeah, those other four make sense, but art? I mean, how is art an intellectual virtue?
Well, that's a very good question. Because when people are first exposed to these intellectual virtues, that's the thing that kind of strikes them, and they have to take a double take. How is art a virtue?
Yeah.
But it's very specific for Saint Thomas, and Saint Thomas develops what Aristotle had started, is that there are two virtues of what Saint Thomas calls the practical intellect, or the practical intellect, which is basically reason put into praxis. Practical reason. How do we put reason into our daily life? And there are two ways that can happen. We can have right reason applied to our action, or about what we do, and that would be prudence.
Right.
Or in the Latin, recto ratio agibilium, what we do, right reason applied to what we do, which would be prudence. But then, right reason as applied to what we make, which is outside of ourselves. So not our own action, but right reason as applied to things made, recto ratio factibilium. And that would be art. And so both art and prudence have this in common, is that they both are reason as applied, but applied in different ways. Prudence is right understanding, right reason applied to how we act, and art would be truly a virtue, but right reason applied to things made. And how's that a virtue? Well, virtue would be a habit, a disposition, perfecting the human person towards good action. And one of the unique things about the human person is that we make things in the external world.
Right,
we make tools, for example. Yeah.
And we make beautiful things.
Exactly.
Technology, all of this. And I think this is what's great about these intellectual virtues is we live in a time when it's assumed that the intellect is not the highest powered man, that really your feelings, your emotions are the highest. And so I think by looking at these virtues, we can ask ourselves, well, how is it that I create a virtuous intellect? Because a virtue, as you just said, is a habit. It's something repeated. And we really do need to rediscover what it means to not only be virtuous, but have a virtuous intellect. Because not only with our actions, but the things we make. And this could be applied to film. That's
absolutely right.
Architecture, novels. I mean, all the things that we value so much, and especially in an internet age with apps and podcasts and YouTube, these virtues need to be applied by Christians in the public square. So this is really an important topic.
Absolutely, it's a huge topic, and it's all the more important when we realize that you said it earlier. They're really lost virtues. We don't even think of them anymore as virtues. For example, art is not thought of as a virtue. Aristotle, when he said the word, what is translated in English as art, would have been the Greek techne, where we get the word in English technique or technical or technician. So it would be more akin to the English words craft or skill. And those English words craft or skill have more of the character of a virtue in modern parlance. But we forget that art or craft, how we craft the world around us, is truly an application of the right reason and the intellect that we first have the virtue that we first have in our intellect. How we understand the world around us, and how we understand how we as human beings are to, in a sense, interface with the world around us.
Yes. Okay, so that's art or techne, skill, craft.
Yeah.
And prudence, we generally know prudence, right? This is making right decisions. But let's look at the other three. Okay, so maybe should we start with wisdom?
Sure, yeah, we can start with wisdom. Well, with the three virtues, the three other virtues besides prudence and art would be understanding, knowledge, and wisdom. And what makes these three intellectual virtues unique is that they are not part of the practical intellect. As I say, Thomas put prudence and art in the practical intellect. But they all perfect what St. Thomas would call the speculative intellect, which is an intellect which is not ordered towards praxis or applying what we know, but it's just strictly and purely ordered towards knowing simply. Just knowing the truth, bringing the truth that we can see in the world around us inside our intellect and knowing it.
Right.
Or we get the word speculative, or gazing on it. Yeah. Just looking at it.
I sometimes describe this to students as wisdom is getting the big picture.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Getting the big picture isn't necessarily applying it to which car should I drive or where should I eat or how many calories. Those kind of go more towards prudence, making particular judgments. But wisdom, Sophia, is the big picture, right? The big architecture of how we should think and act in this world under God.
Absolutely. So wisdom specifically would be a knowledge of highest causes. Highest causes. Now, what does that mean? I mean, in the Summa Theologiae, St. Thomas mentions that wisdom is the knowledge of highest causes. But when we say the knowledge of highest causes or first causes, wisdom is able to look at the whole spectrum of human knowledge. Wisdom is able to look at all of the sciences, for example, all of the ways that the sciences can be applied through prudence and art, and is able to judge them all in one large vision. Because wisdom looks at the highest causes, so it holds the highest causes, in a sense, contemplates the highest causes. It is able to judge many different things in the world around us under one ratio of wisdom. And ultimately, the first cause of the highest cause would be God. So to see everything in light of God.
Perfect. Now, how is that different than the next one, understanding?
Well, understanding is important too. It also has the same sort of intuitive character that wisdom does, but understanding is not a knowledge of highest causes or first causes, but understanding is a knowledge of first principles. First principles. So it's the difference between a cause and a principle. And for Saint Thomas Aquinas, following Aristotle, principles and causes are different things. A principle specifically would be something out of which a thing proceeds in any way, and a cause would be something out of which a thing proceeds with some mode of dependence. So now, what would be a principle? Understanding is the habit of principles, the virtue by which we understand first principles. So a first principle would be something like the principle of non-contradiction.
Right.
A thing cannot be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. Now, that's a first principle, because to understand that, you can't appeal to any more, in a sense, primitive principles.
Right.
You just have to understand that. You just have to see it with your understanding. If a person does not understand that a thing cannot be and not be at the same time and in the same respect, there's nothing you could say to that person. There's no way you could argue with that person to get him to see it. Because to argue with somebody would be to appeal to another principle. And these things are fundamentally first principles.
Right.
That makes sense?
Yeah, something can't be true and not true at the same time.
Exactly.
If you don't grasp that, you can have understanding about nothing.
It's exactly right. That's exactly right. And Aristotle himself mentions this when he talks about if a student were to ask for a proof of the principle of non-contradiction. He simply says a proof couldn't be given.
Right.
You would have to appeal to something more fundamental.
Yeah.
And understanding is the habit by which we see these fundamental principles.
Now, do you think in our day, I mean, it seems like right away, this and wisdom, but this one I think is most under attack, this intellectual virtue. Because if you live in a society that's relativistic, hey, that's true for you, but it's not true for me.
That's right.
Right? That's an attack on the virtue of wisdom. Anyone who thinks like that and says, that's true for you, but it's not true for me. Let's say abortion. Right? Abortion is a sin for you, but it's not for me. Mm-hmm. Anyone who's saying or thinking like that has, in a certain sense, eroded away any virtue of understanding that they have. There's an attack there. For the person who has true understanding, they would cultivate these first principles to think correctly. They would be logical. Right. So it seems that in our culture, especially in the West, this is the virtue that's really under attack.
I think you make a great point, and I think you're absolutely right about that. We've lost in our society right now the idea that there even are first principles that must be understood. For example, the principle of non-contradiction. A thing cannot be and not be at the same time. There's also, for Saint Thomas, another first principle of praxis, or the first principle of the practical intellect, which is that good ought to be done, evil ought to be avoided.
Yeah, that's where natural law flows.
That's natural law comes from this.
Yes.
And it is a first principle.
That's right.
In the sense that if a person does not understand that evil ought to be avoided and good ought to be done, there's no way you could argue with that person.
Right.
You could not have a moral conversation with that person.
And that's where we are today.
You're right. You're absolutely right. And this is why, we are in that place today. Certainly, with any kind of a complete erosion of the understanding of natural law, but also the dialogue about morality has eroded away because we've lost the ability to even dialogue with each other within a common medium of understanding about moral principles.
Yep.
So if a person were to say, well, that's true for you, that, let's say, abortion is wrong, that's a truth that's your truth, but that's not my truth. No. The virtue of understanding has been eroded. So it's been eroded away so much that the very foundations of a conversation are gone.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to the modern secular university, these principles, these first principles or understanding, is not assumed anymore.
It's really not,
which is just crazy.
Yeah, and when we don't assume these first principles, we lose not just the ability to understand truths, but we lose the ability to even talk with each other about these things. And that's why I think it's so important that we revive these intellectual virtues and try to shine more light on them.
Would logic or dialectic apply here to understanding?
Understanding is yes.
Yeah. It kind of derives.
It derives. Yes, because logic, or Aristotle's logical treatise, where it's called the Organon, or that would be the tools in Greek. So logic is basically just, if somebody's studying logic, you're studying the tools of thinking.
Yep.
These are the tools of thinking, and one of the tools of thinking is just to understand first principles. You have to know these, and the first principles are the principles from which we logically deduce through logical reasoning other causes or principles, and this is where the virtue of science comes in.
Good. So we've
knowledge.
We've covered art and prudence. We did wisdom, understanding. So now we're getting into the fifth one here. Knowledge. Yes. Scientia in the Latin.
Right? Yes. Knowledge. So how does that work? We have understanding, which is a knowledge of principles, or the habit of principles. Wisdom, which is the seeing of highest causes. Then we have science in the middle. Science, or knowledge, is the habit.
Let's pause there, because I think some people watching are like, well, how are you going back and forth from science and knowledge? Okay. Because in the modern context, science is like, oh, he's doing the scientific method, or he's weighing and measuring specimens and all that. And when we read Thomas Aquinas, especially if we read an older translation, we see science all over the place, and that's just the Latin word, scientia, which means knowledge. So
Yeah.
science equals knowledge, knowledge equals science for Thomas Aquinas. So for Aquinas, philosophy is a science. It's a body of knowledge. Theology is a science. Biology is a science. Anything that you can have knowledge about is a science. So I think we just got to put that little commercial in there for the old school understanding of science, because I think that'll help people as we get into this understand, hey, when we say science, we mean knowledge, and when we say knowledge, we mean science.
That is very important. Thank you for thank you for that little commercial.
Yeah.
It is true. In the contemporary world, when we say the word science, we're usually thinking of a very specific method, or the scientific method, which would be applied to the natural sciences. And that's related to what St. Thomas understood by science. But when St. Thomas said scientia, or knowledge, it was a much broader understanding than just our contemporary method, a very specific method. So thank you for science and knowledge for St. Thomas would be the same thing. And as far as the virtue goes of knowledge or science, it would be a discursive movement, and I will explain that. It would be a movement from principles to causes. Wisdom is a understanding of highest causes. Understanding is a understanding first principles. Through knowledge or science, we move step by step and part by part from the principles to conclusions. And we, as human beings, because we are not angels.
So it's like going A to B, B to C, C to D, right?
Exactly. And so science.
And hold on, you were about to say angels, and I know what you're going to say, and I want you to say it because it's really cool.
Okay.
About angels in our minds.
Yeah, well, angels, because angels are, purely spiritual creatures. They do not, in a sense, their thinking, in a sense, is not. They don't have to think under the burden of bodies, or they don't have to labor through with the use of a material organ. Like
right. They don't have to do long division like we do.
No, they don't. Their knowledge or their reason is what St. Thomas would call purely intuitive. Right. Intuitive. Because they do not have to, let's say, as we process through knowledge part by part, they don't simply have to go part by part. But they can have an intuitive understanding immediately of not only the principles, but all the conclusions that follow from the principles.
Right.
Whereas for the human person, because we are composite creatures, we have a spiritual soul, so we have intellects. But we also have bodies, and we exist in a natural, very regular flow of time. Right. So when we understand principles, we have to reason part by part and through time from these principles to causes, or ultimately highest causes, which would be God. And that virtue, or that habit, that helps us in that process of going part by part from principles to causes. If A is true, B is true. If A and B are true, then C is true. If B and C are true, D is true. That is knowledge or science.
Right. And it's interesting because Thomas says that the knowledge of God is not self-evident for humans. Because, and that surprises people. We did a video on that recently in the New St. Thomas Institute. That surprises people because we Christians want to say, of course, the knowledge of God is self-evident. But Thomas means that, no, we humans have to go from A to B to B to C to D. So,
that's right.
You observe the Grand Canyon, you see a tree, you hear the wind, all these things, and you begin to start asking questions about what caused these movements, or what created these things, or where did this principle of something can't be both true and not true at the same time. And as you travel upward, right, on this discursive trail, you then arrive at a knowledge of, there must be a first prime mover. Yeah. There must be one who is good. And you make these conclusions. And this is what's related to science or knowledge, scientia.
That's right. Or there must be, simply put, a highest cause, which would be wisdom. And that's a great point. I think actually St. Thomas's 5 ways to the existence of God are a perfect example of these intellectual virtues at work.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. You're right. Mm-hmm.
They're a perfect example of all three of the virtues of the speculative intellect at work and in their order. Because Saint Thomas is certainly a deep intuitive thinker, but he is such a master of logic, and he understands how thinking works.
Yes.
He understands, before he approaches these questions, he first has trained his intellectual virtues. He understands how human thinking works. And this is why, it does come to a surprise to many people when Saint Thomas, says in contradiction to Saint Anselm, for example, that we do not have God's existence isn't self-evident.
Right.
The way it would be, for an angel, it says. I mean, it might be self-evident in itself, but to us, it's not, because the way our human thinking works. We have to begin with principles. Yep. Principles like, a thing cannot be its own mover.
Right. Or
a thing cannot be its own cause. But what does St. Thomas actually say with regards to the second way? Because, of course, God is its own cause. But human beings move from these principles through knowledge to causes.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's the 5 virtues. We had the wisdom. Mm-hmm. We had wisdom, which is the big pictures, the causes, right?
Yeah.
Going all the way up to God, right? And then we get understanding. This is the principles.
Yes.
And then knowledge, right, which is this discursive pattern of discovery.
Mm-hmm. And again, when I say discursive, I'm that discursive as opposed to an intuitive.
That's right. So, like, I always, I teach like freshmen. Discursive. Think about like the word cursive. Like when you write cursive, all the letters. If you write cursive, if you wrote brother, B and then R O, those are all connected.
Yeah.
Going. So discursive thinking is how humans think, and we kind of go along letter to letter. They're all connected, right? But they're going along. So discursive thinking is A to B, B to C, C to D, all the way to Z or whatever you're trying to get. So that's
a great example.
That captures knowledge for us, right? And then prudence is the applying of all of these things that we just talked about, the speculative things, into your practical life.
That's right.
And this has to do with making moral decisions, but also everyday decisions, which may not be strictly moral. Like if you have a large family, you need to make a prudential decision on how you're going to spend money, or which car you're going to drive, or where you should live. Maybe living in Manhattan, if you have 9 kids, isn't the prudent thing to do, right? Maybe you should move somewhere else, or in a high crime area, or something like that. If you can move, that is.
Yes.
And then we get to art. And this is kind of my favorite one because it's so misunderstood. And I think we should close on it. We kind of started with it, and let's come back to it. Now, you've been working on a thesis, right?
Yes, for a philosophy degree.
Okay, tell us about it.
Well, I've been focusing in my own thesis. I've been focusing on the virtue of art, and the virtue of art connection to the other virtues. Certainly, the connection between the virtue of art and the virtues that are purely intellectual, wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, but also the connection between art and prudence, and then ultimately the other moral virtues as well. Prudence, courage, justice, and temperance. So, there is a connection there. Like I said, prudence and art are both practical intellectual virtues, because they take the knowledge that we have, the knowledge that we have received and the wisdom that we have, and they apply it. First, prudence applies to action, art applies it to things that we make. And the human person is unique in all creation because we can understand highest causes through the intellect. But then once we understand these causes, we can reinvest the created world around us with a share of that reason, or a share of God's very ratio that we first have seen with our intellect.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and the way we invest the world around us with a greater share of that reason or a greater share of that goodness is through art.
Yes.
And then the way we reinvest ourselves, our composite beings, with a greater share of that natural law or that reason that we see is through prudence.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also why prudence, although it is numbered among the intellectual virtues, is also numbered amongst the moral virtues.
Right.
Because it is intellectual, but it also perfects the human person in our action.
Yes. This is what's great, because the intellectual virtues sort of link up. It's the hinge with prudence. And this is why Thomas and others and Dante in the Divine Comedy speak of prudence as the first amongst the cardinal virtues. I think
That's
Dante,
right.
He depicts prudence as a figure of 3 eyeballs. He has an extra eyeball because he's the lead dog, right?
Yeah.
Prudence is the lead dog. Now, I think this is especially interesting for our time, and I like your take on it because you're writing on it. We live in a time in which there is a lot of, because of the internet, things that we create, whether they be an iPhone or a piece of art or even a video on YouTube. We can now extend the things that we make in a way that no other humans in history have ever done. Ever.
That's right.
So this means that art takes on a new significance for our time. And we have things like pornography or movies that are completely degrading, even if they're not pornography, and things that are done through the internet. How is it that art, craft, how is it that we as Christians can infuse our culture with our own, virtue of art, craft, skill? It seems that the Holy Fathers, the popes, have been asking us to do this. It doesn't seem like many people are Catholics taking up the challenge. So, as a Dominican order of preachers, how do we proclaim this truth to put a fire under Christians to cultivate this virtue and then extend it in the public square?
Well, it's a fantastic question. That is, I think that is the moral imperative of our time, particularly for Christians, because we live in a world, as you said, where through media, through communication, we can take our craft or our art, the things that we produce, and spread it throughout the world very quickly. I think the first thing that we have to realize as Christians is we have to reclaim an understanding of art as a product of the human person's intellect. That art is coming from our understanding of the world. Art, particularly the fine arts, painting, music, sculpture, architecture, these things are there to enrich the human person and enrich the human person's understanding of the world. Music, for example, can inspire the human person's passions. Music can affect the human person's passions. Music can excite us. Music can put us, as we can see with things like Gregorian chant or polyphony, music can put us into a prayerful state. Music can order our minds to God. Music can also distract us from attention on God. And so precisely that's proof that art does affect the human person intellectually and morally. We have to watch the art that we take in, or be mindful of the art that we take in with our eyes. If we are taking in something with our eyes, it's like, let's say, corrupt images, like you mentioned, pornography, which is an epidemic problem right now. Or if we take in images through movies or something that are not portraying the human person in light of the human person's ultimate end, which is beatitude, or to be happy, to contemplate God, but images or movies that are degrading to the human person. Images and movies that show the human person acting like a brute animal, for example. Those images will go into our mind, into our imagination, and slowly erode our understanding
Right.
of what the human person is supposed to be ordered towards.
That's right. Because your mind in your imagination is like an art gallery.
That's right.
And God set it up so anytime you see something, hear it, any of your five senses, it goes on the wall in the gallery.
That's right.
And it's very difficult to remove a painting from the wall once it's in there. Right?
That's right.
And God made it that way for our survival and for our happiness. But he also gave us control so that we can limit and protect and guard what's there. Not always can we do that. Sometimes kids are exposed to horrible things, right? And that's a different situation. But we can willingly allow some of this garbage in. And when we do, we are definitely not cultivating these intellectual virtues.
No, we're not cultivating them. We could actually be eroding them away.
Yeah, or an intellectual vice.
That's right. That's right. And so, I'm glad you brought that up about the imagination being like an art gallery, because the imagination is given to us by God. It's one of the internal senses. We have an imagination which can be a storehouse, in many ways, of those images that we take in, a storehouse of that music that we take in. And once it's in there, the imagination, being a good gift from God, we need it. The imagination is going to do its job. And it's going to keep those images in our mind.
That's right.
And the more we have these images in our mind of things which are base or corruptive to the human person, the more it will not just stay in there idle, or these images won't just stay in our minds idle, but they can slowly, if it's unchecked, they can corrode our understanding of the world around us.
That's right.
They can corrode our ability to see the truth around us, the truth of the world, the truths of God, and ultimately the truths of the human person.
Yep. Now, there may be someone that's watching, and maybe we'll close with this, but who says, you know what, I've seen a lot of bad stuff. My intellect, my art gallery just has a lot of just trash on the wall. Am I doomed? I mean, how could I ever, remove all that? And I think the answer for this person is, hey, God's grace, his sanctifying grace, his actual graces, can renew you inwardly, as St. Paul says. And so there is healing, and these things can be supernaturally overcome. Obviously, by nature, we could never overcome these things. This is something Aristotle probably wouldn't have been able to fully appreciate. But it's something that Thomas Aquinas does bring to the table. That you could have someone like St. Augustine, who had at least 2 concubines we know of, and a lot of sin, and probably seen a lot of bad stuff, but become a great saint and purify the imagination, purify the intellect through these virtues.
That's absolutely right.
Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely right. No, that's certainly a question that I am asked a lot, because nobody in the contemporary world, especially since the advent of the internet, can remain entirely immune to these influences.
That's right.
Yeah,
television.
Nobody can.
Yeah, or even just walk around the local mall. You're going to see immodest, horrible things. So I think it's important for we Christians in this time to offer this to God and say, God, I need you to perfect these virtues in me because of things in my past and things in the present. I want to be a saint, and part of being a saint is loving the Lord your God with all your heart and your mind, right? Your mind, your soul, your heart, but also your intellect. And this teaching from Thomas Aquinas shows that we must perfect not just our moral life, but our intellectual life, and everything kind of flows from that.
Right.
So it's beautiful. I mean, this is a great teaching.
And St. Paul, this is one of my favorite passages, be transformed by the renewal of your minds.
That's right.
Renewal of our minds. So through grace, through the grace given to us in Jesus Christ through our baptism, we can through infused grace and the infused virtues, we can, no matter where we have been, no matter how our imaginations might have been corrupted, we can turn the boat around, so to speak. Right. We can start to fill our minds with good, healthy things. Start to read, images of the saints, images from Scripture.
Our Lady.
That's a perfect example. I have a crucifix here on the back wall. So stare at the crucifix, for example.
Right.
Fill your mind with images of divine things. Yep. And when it comes to music, fill your mind with good music.
Yeah. Right.
Fill your mind with good music. Music that does not serve as a vehicle for, let's say, perverse language.
Yeah.
stay away from this.
Definitely.
You know? And what Saint Thomas understood, because he lived in he understood that Jesus Christ gives us grace, and conversion is always possible, no matter where we've been. Saint Thomas understood that the virtues, no matter how they have been corrupted by our past actions, can always be restored.
Yes, that's
right. Always be restored.
Right. Divine mercy. Divine mercy.
Divine mercy is always there,
yep.
And it's always offered to everyone. And I think even in our time, the Lord is pouring His mercy out in an even greater abundance.
I agree. I agree. Well, Brother Bradley, this has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed this. This is a wonderful topic, and I think there's going to be a lot of questions and comments. So we're definitely going to have you back, I think, especially for all the questions and comments. And I want to ask all the new St. Thomas Institute members to pray for you.
Thank you very much.
And to pray for all the Dominicans. We have a special love for the Dominicans because of Saint Thomas Aquinas, of course.
Yes.
So our prayers are with you, and we look forward to seeing you on the screen again sometime in the future.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marshall. It's my blessing. So thank you.
All right. God bless. All right. Well, I hope that whet your appetite to study St. Thomas Aquinas, and I have a really big announcement. We have opened up enrollment once again for the new St. Thomas Institute, and we have a reduced tuition rate and 5 bonuses, including my book, The Crucified Rabbi, for free, 3 MP3s, one on the theology of St. Joseph, Josephology, one on Catholic masculinity and how we've lost it, and also another one on how to pray the rosary daily. I also put in a Catholic cheat sheet, which gives you all the Bible verses for all the Catholic doctrines, and there's a couple other bonuses, and I want you to check all this out because after July 8th, 2014, this offer is going to go away, including the reduced tuition. So if you thought about joining New St. Thomas Institute, this is the week to join. So you need to go over to newstthomas.com, newstthomas.com. Read about it there. If it's for you, sign up. Make sure you do it before July 8th because after that, it won't be available. Well, hey, thanks so much for listening, and thanks so much to Brother Bradley Elliott for coming on and talking about the 5 intellectual virtues. I just loved this conversation, this interview. And may you continue to grow in your love for Christ and for Mary and the Church and St. Thomas Aquinas. And until next time, remember, our Lord Jesus Christ said that you are the light of the world and the salt of the earth. So go out there and be salty.